the shadows of Phoenix, Arizona, a killer lurked, silently wreaking havoc and instilling fear into every corner of the city. He left no trace, offered no warning, only lifeless bodies and dark secrets waiting to be unraveled. When his true face was finally exposed, a world of unspeakable horrors was laid bare. Will you dare to face the truth behind his terror? Welcome back to Room 57, where we uncover the darkest and most shocking criminal cases in American history. Today, we'll explore the story of one of the most chilling serial killers the U.S. has ever known, Mark Goudeau, the man behind the terrifying crime spree that left Phoenix in a state of fear, known as the Baseline Killer. Goudeau's reign of terror was marked by gruesome murders, rapes, and robberies that went undetected for months. He blended into the fabric of everyday life, a seemingly ordinary man, hiding in plain sight while committing horrendous crimes. But how did Mark Goudeau, an individual with a past that seemed far from suspicious, become one of the most infamous serial killers in U.S. history? In today's video, we'll take a deep dive into the twisted journey of Mark Goudeau, exploring his shocking criminal activities, the painstaking investigation by the FBI, and the secrets hidden within the classified files that eventually led to his capture. Get ready to be gripped by the chilling details of one of the most terrifying crime sprees in modern history. This story will haunt you long after it ends. Part 1. The Shadow Lurking in Phoenix. Mark Goudeau's early crimes. Phoenix, Arizona, home to bright desert landscapes and a relaxed city atmosphere. But beneath the surface of this seemingly tranquil city, a nightmare was quietly unfolding. In the early 2000s, Phoenix was gripped by an alarming series of violent attacks on women, attacks that would leave the city paralyzed with fear. The killer behind these heinous acts was Mark Goudeau, a man who seemed completely ordinary, yet became the embodiment of terror for an entire community. Mark Goudeau wasn't always a name associated with brutality. He was born in 1966, raised in Phoenix, and, like many others, led a life that appeared normal on the outside. However, beneath his facade, something much darker was taking shape. In 1999, Goudeau was convicted of rape and kidnapping and sentenced to prison. But his time behind bars didn't reform him. It served as an incubator for his rage and violence. Upon his release in 2004, he would embark on one of the most chilling crime sprees in Phoenix's history, the Baseline Killer. The early days of terror. Mark Goudeau's first confirmed murder took place in 2005, but his spree would span well into 2006. The victims were often vulnerable women, those who lived on the fringes of society. Some were homeless, others sex workers, and many were living in poverty. Goudeau preyed on these women, targeting them when they were most vulnerable. His method was always the same. He would approach his victims under the guise of something innocent, then attack them with brutal force. His killings were often preceded by sexual assault, and in most cases, he left his victims for dead, leaving no clear pattern or motive behind the murders. At first, investigators were stumped. The city of Phoenix was in shock. Someone was killing women, but no one knew who or why. Goudeau's crimes didn't follow the typical patterns of a serial killer. He was smart, leaving behind no obvious evidence, no fingerprints, and no physical traces that would lead police directly to him. The victims didn't know him, and there was no link between them except for the fact that they had all been brutally attacked and left in despair, a city in fear. The pattern emerged as Goudeau's attacks escalated, so did the public's fear. Phoenix had always been a city with a mix of people from all walks of life, but suddenly, it became a place filled with dread. Women stopped walking alone at night, and families grew anxious about what was happening in their own neighborhoods. The attacks seemed random, but there was something chillingly familiar about each one, something that hinted at the work of a single, calculating killer. The police could find no obvious connections between the murders, but the growing number of victims was undeniable. Women were being murdered and assaulted across different parts of the city, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The killer was always one step ahead. He knew how to avoid detection, how to leave no trace of himself behind. For months, authorities had no idea who the killer was, but as the body count climbed, the investigation began to focus on one key detail: DNA. At several of the crime scenes, investigators found traces of DNA that could potentially be linked to the killer. It was a breakthrough, but it still wasn't enough to identify the man behind the terror. By 2006, the FBI was brought in to assist local authorities. They pieced together that the killer wasn't just a random individual. He was someone who had been active for years, and his crimes were only growing in frequency and severity. The term Baseline Killer would soon become synonymous with fear. He was a predator who didn't discriminate, and the city of Phoenix had no idea who was lurking in their midst. A killer who blended the only of the most terrifying aspects of Goudeau's killing spree was his ability to blend into the community. He wasn't a loner or a recluse. He was a man who could walk down the street, talk to people, and remain completely unnoticed. This made him particularly dangerous. No one knew who he was. No one suspected him, and he knew exactly how to move through the city without raising suspicion, unlike many serial killers who make careless mistakes. Goudeau was meticulous. He was methodical, and he understood the importance of staying under the radar. His ability to appear ordinary, to interact with people without arousing suspicion, made him almost invisible to those around him. But as the investigation continued and new forensic techniques were used, authorities began to piece together the puzzle. They started to realize that the killings weren't random, they were part of a much larger, far more calculated plan, and the breakthrough would come in a way no one could have expected. Conclusion of Part 1. Mark Goudeau's reign of terror was just beginning, but with the collection of key evidence, the FBI and local law enforcement were starting to close in. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fit together. As the tension rose, so did the stakes. Could Goudeau continue his killing spree, or would the truth finally come to light? In the next part of this chilling story, we'll explore how the FBI tracked down Goudeau using new forensic breakthroughs, how he was eventually linked to the murders, and the dramatic chase that led to his capture. Stay tuned for more as we uncover the rest of the dark tale of the Baseline Killer, Part 2, the FBI's relentless hunt. Unmasking the Baseline Killer in 10 minutes. As the terrifying crime spree continued, the FBI and local authorities in Phoenix knew they were facing a serial killer unlike any they had ever encountered. Mark Goudeau had evaded capture for years, leaving behind no concrete clues and showing an extraordinary ability to remain under the radar. But as the months wore on, the investigation took a dramatic turn. The FBI's dedication and the use of cutting-edge forensic science were about to uncover the face of the man behind the killings. The breakthrough, DNA, and the connection between 2006. The death toll had risen significantly. Goudeau's reign of terror had grown so intense that it had become clear to investigators that they were dealing with a methodical, organized killer. The city of Phoenix was paralyzed with fear, and the local police were no closer to catching the man responsible. However, the breakthrough came when investigators linked the growing number of murders with a crucial piece of evidence: DNA. Several of the crime scenes had yielded DNA samples, and it became clear that there was a connection between them. But the problem was that the DNA didn't match any known criminal profiles. The samples weren't enough to lead them directly to a suspect, but they confirmed that they were dealing with a serial offender. Meanwhile, the pressure mounted on law enforcement. As each murder occurred, the media coverage grew, fueling more panic in the city. Residents were terrified to leave their homes, especially women. The killer was showing no signs of stopping. The FBI had to step in, and they did so with everything at their disposal: forensic experts, psychological profiles, and a vast network of local and national resources. The shift in focus: a cold case is reopened. While the DNA evidence seemed promising, it still wasn't enough to pinpoint Goudeau. In response, the FBI began to revisit previous cases that had gone cold, hoping to identify a pattern and link them to the current murders. One of the most crucial moments in the investigation came when they revisited a 1999 rape and kidnapping case involving Mark Goudeau. This case had slipped through the cracks years earlier, but now it seemed eerily relevant. The investigation revealed that Goudeau had been convicted of this crime, serving a prison sentence before his release in 2004. What investigators didn't know at the time was that the man who had committed this earlier crime had also become the Baseline Killer. This was a key piece of the puzzle, because Goudeau's DNA had been collected after his 1999 conviction. When authorities compared this DNA with the evidence collected from the more recent murders, they realized that they had finally found the match they had been searching for. Goudeau's DNA was a perfect match with the DNA found at multiple crime scenes. This discovery was monumental. The killer they had been hunting for years, whose trail seemed to vanish after each murder, was now identified. But the journey to bring Mark Goudeau to justice wasn't going to be as simple as just arresting him. The case had become more complex, and the investigation was about to enter its most dangerous, intense phase: the surveillance. And the rest, since Goudeau's identity was confirmed, the FBI launched a full-scale operation to capture him. However, even with the DNA match, Goudeau remained elusive. He had proven his ability to avoid detection in the past, and law enforcement knew that he would stop at nothing to evade capture. For weeks, the FBI and local law enforcement officers set up surveillance on Goudeau, following him and monitoring his movements. They knew they had to catch him in the act. If they let him slip through their fingers again, he might vanish for good. This phase of the investigation was tense, with every move Goudeau made under a microscope. On August 6, 2007, the waiting game finally came to an end. The FBI had gathered enough evidence and observed Goudeau long enough to warrant an arrest. They moved in quickly, and Mark Goudeau was taken into custody without incident. As the handcuffs were snapped on his wrists, it was a moment of bitter triumph for the authorities. But there was little time to celebrate. They had finally captured the man who had terrorized Phoenix for years. but they now faced the daunting task of bringing him to trial for his horrific crimes. The investigation's toll, victims, and their familiar how the arrest of Mark Goudeau was a victory, it was not the end of the story. The victims of his brutal spree and their families were left to process the trauma that had been inflicted upon them throughout the investigation. The FBI and the police had been in close contact with the victims' families, but nothing could undo the damage that had been done. Many of Goudeau's victims had been left to face lives shattered by violence and fear. Some were sexually assaulted before they were murdered, others were left for dead, their bodies discarded like trash. The long journey to justice had left many families waiting for closure. But even after Goudeau's arrest, the damage had been done. Victims' families had waited for years for justice to be served. The psychological toll was devastating. Some women had been left paralyzed by fear, others emotionally scarred, unable to trust or feel safe in their own homes. It was impossible to quantify the lasting effects of Goudeau's crimes on Phoenix's community, but the emotional scars left behind would be carried for a lifetime. The trial that would follow would become a battle for justice, but also for closure for both the victims and their families. The trial of Mark Goudeau. Once Goudeau was arrested, the wheels of justice began to turn. The trial would be long and contentious. Goudeau faced multiple charges, including 9 counts of murder, sexual assault, and kidnapping. The evidence against him was overwhelming. In addition to the DNA match, numerous forensic experts testified about the brutality of his crimes. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of a man who had stalked his victims in the dead of night, attacking them with no regard for their humanity. His methodical approach to killing, the lack of remorse, and the sheer cruelty of his actions shocked even the most hardened of law enforcement officials. In contrast, Goudeau's defense team argued that the DNA evidence wasn't conclusive enough to ensure a conviction. They questioned the integrity of the forensic processes and tried to sow doubt in the minds of the jurors. However, the mountain of evidence was too much to dismiss. After months of deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Mark Goudeau was sentenced to death for his crimes. The legacy of the baseline killer Mark Goudeau's capture and conviction brought an end to a terrifying chapter in Phoenix's history. His name became synonymous with the baseline killer, and his reign of terror was over. Yet, for many, the damage had already been done. The case served as a reminder of the fragility of life, of how quickly safety could be stripped away, and how one person's actions could destroy so many lives. Conclusion of Part 2. The journey to bring Mark Goudeau to justice was one filled with tension, heartbreak, and relentless determination. His capture and trial marked the end of a horrific era for Phoenix, but for the victims, the families, and the city as a whole, the scars of his crimes will last far beyond the courtroom. In the next part, we'll delve into the final phase of the case, Goudeau's time on death row, and the lasting impact his crimes had on the community. We'll also examine how his case became a pivotal moment for both local law enforcement and the FBI, serving as a powerful reminder of the consequences of unchecked evil and the unyielding pursuit of justice. Part 3, the aftermath and the final chapter of the baseline killer. 10 minutes with Mark Goudeau's conviction and sentencing. Phoenix, Arizona, began to heal from the scars left by his brutal killing spree. The community could finally breathe a sigh of relief, but for many, the emotional damage inflicted by his crimes would linger. This final chapter of the case is not just about the legal proceedings or the aftermath of his capture, but about the ripple effects on the victims, their families, and the city of Phoenix itself. It's also a sobering reminder of how the justice system navigates the complexities of serial crime, punishment, and closure. Mark Goudeau's time on death row. After his conviction in 2007, Mark Goudeau was sentenced to death for his horrific crimes. While his fate was sealed, his time on death row was anything but swift. In the United States, the death penalty is a long and drawn-out process, and Goudeau's case was no exception. Although he was convicted, Goudeau continued to appeal his sentence, claiming that he was not given a fair trial and challenging the DNA evidence that had linked him to the murders. These appeals dragged on for years, and although they were ultimately unsuccessful, they kept his case in the public eye long after the trial had ended. His time on death row became a waiting game for both the authorities and the families of his victims, who anxiously awaited the final resolution. For Goudeau, the lengthy appeals process was a stark reminder of the legal system's sometimes agonizingly slow pace. While the public had moved on from the horror he caused, he still had the chance to fight for his life. But for the families of his victims, each day of delay felt like another injustice, another painful reminder that their loved ones would never come back. It wasn't until 2017 that the courts finally rejected his last appeal, and Goudeau's death sentence remained in place. However, his execution has yet to be carried out, as it often takes many years for death penalty cases to be resolved in the United States. The victims' faces of innocence and tragedy as much as the trial and legal proceedings were about justice. There was a far deeper emotional toll for the victims of Mark Goudeau's crimes. The families of the women he killed, as well as those he assaulted, had been left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. For the women who survived his attacks, the trauma was profound. Many of them lived with the constant fear that Goudeau might return to finish what he started. Survivors of sexual assault and murder attempts are often left with psychological scars that endure far longer than the physical ones. In Goudeau's case, the fear of being hunted and stalked by a killer who could slip through the cracks of the justice system only added to the deep emotional wounds. For the families of Goudeau's victims, the pain was even greater. Each victim was a person with dreams, aspiration, and loved ones, innocent women whose lives were stolen too soon. Their families were left to mourn, to ask questions without answers, and to struggle with the devastating reality that their loved ones had been taken in such a brutal, senseless way. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case was the realization that many of Goudeau's victims were among the most vulnerable in society. Homeless women and sex workers, people whom society often overlooks, were among his targets. This stark reality served as a painful reminder of the vulnerability of these individuals, whose lives were already fraught with hardships, only to be made worse by the violence they suffered at the hands of a brutal killer. The emotional toll on Phoenix and law enforcement's impact of Goudeau's killing spree on Phoenix was profound. The city, once considered a safe and peaceful place, had become a place filled with fear. People were afraid to walk the streets at night, and the once vibrant neighborhoods became ghostly quiet. After dark, parents warned their children not to go out alone, and even adults found themselves looking over their shoulders in the dark. Law enforcement, too, had to bear the weight of this fear. The investigation was long and grueling, and for many officers, it became a personal mission to catch Goudeau and stop the bloodshed. They had watched as the body count grew, as families were torn apart, and as the city descended into a state of terror. Despite all their efforts, Goudeau was elusive for years, and each new murder was a crushing blow to the morale of those who were working tirelessly to bring him to justice. Even after Goudeau's arrest, the emotional toll on the police and the investigators was palpable. While they were able to bring the case to a close, the process of dealing with the aftermath of the lives ruined, the pain left behind was something they would never forget. The FBI agents involved in the case found it hard to shake the images of the brutalized victims and the terror that had gripped the city. For many, the case would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Public outcry and the controversy over the death penalty as Goudeau's case made its way through the legal system. It sparked renewed debates about the death penalty in the United States. Phoenix, like many other cities in the country, was divided on the issue. Some believed that Goudeau deserved to die for the horrific acts he committed, while others questioned whether the state should have the right to take his life even after everything he had done. The debate over capital punishment intensified with the prolonged delays in Goudeau's execution. Opponents of the death penalty argued that the prolonged appeals process was inhumane and unjust. They pointed to the fact that Goudeau's execution had been delayed for over a decade as proof that the death penalty in the U.S. was a broken system. Those in favor of capital punishment, however, saw it as the only fitting punishment for someone who had taken so many innocent lives. This debate is still ongoing, and Goudeau's case remains a controversial example of the difficulties and ethical questions surrounding the death penalty in the United States. The case that shaped law enforcement's approach to serial killers, Mark Goudeau's case, not only marked the end of a reign of terror, but also became a significant moment in the evolution of how law enforcement approaches serial crimes. The investigation into the baseline killer case was one of the most challenging and complex in Phoenix's history. It pushed the limits of forensic science, psychological profiling, and interagency collaboration. The case demonstrated the importance of DNA in modern investigations, as it was the breakthrough piece of evidence that ultimately linked Goudeau to the murders. It also highlighted the need for more resources and training for law enforcement officers dealing with serial crimes. The FBI's role in this case demonstrated the necessity of federal involvement when a crime spree spans multiple jurisdictions and overwhelms local law enforcement. Moreover, Goudeau's case became a textbook example of the emotional and psychological toll that serial killers have on entire communities. It served as a reminder that law enforcement, while trained to handle criminal investigations, are still human, and their work often comes at a significant emotional cost. Conclusion of Part 3. The story of Mark Goudeau is one of horror, persistence, and ultimately justice. His crimes left deep scars on the city of Phoenix, the victims, and their families. While his capture brought an end to his reign of terror, the pain and suffering caused by his actions continue to haunt many. The legal proceedings and debates around his punishment also highlight the complexities and challenges of the American justice system, especially in cases involving the death penalty. Goudeau's time on death row and the lasting impact of his Crimes serve as a poignant reminder of the far-reaching consequences of unchecked evil. It is a case that continues to shape discussions on justice, punishment, and the emotional toll of law enforcement and victims alike. While Mark Goudeau's story may seem like a chapter that's closed, the ripple effects of his crimes will continue to be felt for many years to come. What do you think? Do you believe justice was truly served for the victims of Mark Goudeau? Or do you think the case raises deeper questions about the limits of our justice system? Was his capture enough, or do we need to reconsider how we handle cases of this magnitude? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your opinion matters, and we want to hear from you. If you found this story shocking and want more true crime investigations, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you'll never miss a deep dive into some of the darkest, most chilling cases in American history. Share this video with anyone who loves true crime and the world of unsolved mysteries. There's so much more to explore right here on Room 57, a place where we dig into the stories that haunt, shock, and never let you forget. Stay tuned for more, because in Room 57, the stories never end. That concludes the CTA section. It's designed to prompt engagement, encourage subscriptions, and share the video, ensuring that the audience remains hooked for future content. Would you like to expand or adjust any part of it?